The cold wind howled across the alien land, and sharp snowflakes cut through the air like tiny blades as Ethan opened his eyes inside the wrecked human. Dropship buried under broken metal, and thick snow-red lights blinked and smoke filled the cabin. And the sound of crackling fire came from the engine core behind him. He looked around and found two other bodies, lifeless and frozen in the storm. Outside was getting stronger. His head ached and his suit was torn, but the exoskeleton frame on his body still worked halfway, and he pressed the side panel, and it hummed weakly. He had only a few hours before the power cells would fail. Faint sound reached his ears like a cry or a whisper, and he turned and followed it through the half-collapsed corridor. He pulled aside a beam and crawled through the wreckage, and his boots crunched against ice and broken glass. Then he saw a hairy figure, not human and not animal, lying in the snow-covered debris. Hera's body was covered in fine silver fur and glowing. Marks ran along her arms and face, and her legs were twisted in a way that looked painful. She looked up with frightened glowing eyes and whispered something in her alien language, and her voice shook with fear, and Panathan raised his hands slowly to show he meant no harm, and he stepped closer, and she tried to crawl away, but her legs would not move. "Please, do not touch me," she said, in broken English. "Please go. Save yourself and leave me here." He knelt beside her and checked her wounds, and one leg was shattered, and the other was bleeding, and she was freezing. "You will die if I leave you," he said, as he opened his emergency kit and wrapped her in thermal cloth. She shook her head slowly and said, "I am not your kind, I am your enemy," and smiled gently and said, "I do not care about that, not now, not today." He lifted her into his arms, and she cried out softly from the pain, but did not resist. Storm outside roared louder as he stepped out into the blizzard, with her held tight against his chest. The snow hit like ice bullets, and visibility was almost nothing, but the exosuit helped him move forward, step by step through the white hell. Every few steps he slipped and stumbled, but never dropped. Hertha emergency beacon was broken, and his communicator was useless, and he knew the base was over 50 kilometers away through dangerous terrain. She looked up at him through frozen lashes and said, "You are wasting time and strength. I will only slow you down." Looked ahead and said then, "I will go slower, but I will not leave you." They reached a patch of trees and found a small rock cave for shelter, and inside it was dry but cold, and he started a weak thermal lamp and gave her water. She shivered in silence and kept watching him, as if trying to understand why he was doing this. Sethan leaned back and stared at the ceiling of the cave, and memories of Earth flashed in his mind, and he thought of warm meals and fire and music and his dog and his sister, who always believed in kindness. He heard her whisper again, and she said, "Why did you not run when I told you to?" He looked at her and replied, "Maybe because I heard something in your voice that told me you did not want to be alone." She looked away and said nothing for a long while. Next morning, the storm had calmed a little, and he prepared to move again, and he secured her in his arms, and she protested weakly, saying, "The journey will kill you." He smiled and said, "Maybe, but leaving you behind would kill me too." She stared at him with wide eyes, as if hearing such words for the first time, and then closed her eyes and rested her head against his chest. And so he walked again through frozen valleys and hills, carrying her as the exosuit groaned under the weight, and the cold bit at his face and hands. He kept walking without knowing if anyone was coming for them, and without knowing how far they still had to go. He knew as this he would not let go, not today, not tomorrow, not ever. Snow crunched under his boots, and wind hissed like a snake through the mountains, and Ethan held her close, as if holding something fragile and rare. She felt lighter now, but he knew it was not true, and it was only his body going numb and mind going empty from pain and exhaustion. "Her name is Lyra," she said in a low whisper, as if unsure if he even cared. Ethan looked down at her face, which was partly covered by ice and cloth, and said, "Lyra is a beautiful name." She blinked slowly and her glowing violet eyes stared at him with something. Strange something between confusion and sadness. "Why are you doing this?" she asked again. "I am not your friend, and not your kind Ethan." Moved forward without replying because he did not have a good answer, and maybe there was no answer, he reached a frozen ledge and climbed slowly with the suit shaking from pressure, and every step felt like a fight with gravity itself. Lyra winced in his arms and said, "The humans burned my village with fire, and my sister died calling my name, and still no one came to help us." He then paused at the top of the ledge and took a deep breath, and the cold air stung his lungs like needles. "I was not there," he said softly. "I did not do that." She looked away and whispered then, "Why are you helping me now?" "Because you are hurt and alone, and I was raised not to leave people behind," he said, while tightening the grip around her weak body. Lyra stayed quiet for a long time, and then said, "You will die out here, and the snow will bury you, and no one will know." "Maybe," Ethan replied, "but I will not leave you to freeze." In the dark she blinked again, and something inside her face changed, like a crack appearing in a wall built over many years. In her mind, she remembered the stories told to her about human cruelty and human machines that destroyed forests and oceans, and human lies and greed and fire from the sky. Yet this one was carrying her without asking for anything, and his arms were shaking from cold, but he did not stop. They reached a frozen river that stretched wide and silent, and Ethan checked the scanner on his broken wrist pad, and it flashed a weak pulse. "We have to cross," he said. And Lyra nodded faintly, but her face was pale, and her breathing uneven. Halfway across the river, the ice creaked under the weight, and Ethan slowed down and sweat formed on his face. Despite the freezing wind, he looked at her and said, "Do you trust me?" And she stared back and nodded once. He ran fast across the last part of the river, and the ice cracked behind them like thunder, but they made it to the other side just before it collapsed. Ethan collapsed to his knees and gasped for air, and the exosuit made a warning sound that echoed like a dying heartbeat. Leaned against a large stone and held her tighter, and she whispered, "You are not like the others." Yusin smiled weakly and said, "Maybe I am just tired of seeing people suffer." They rested for a while under a frozen tree, and Lyra reached into her coat and pulled out a small glowing crystal. "This will keep you warm," she said, and placed it against his chest, and it melted the frost on his jacket like sunlight on morning dew. "Where did you get this?" he asked, and she said, "It is part of my family's legacy, and I never gave it to anyone before." "Why me?" Ethan asked, and she replied, "Because you saw me not as an alien or enemy, but as someone worth saving." Said, "Thank you," and she leaned her head on his chest again, and her breathing slowed, and she finally fell asleep. Ethan stared at the gray sky and snowflakes falling like feathers, and wondered how long he could keep going and how long before the cold finally won. But when he looked down at her sleeping peacefully in his arms, he knew he had to try. Stood again and felt the pain in his legs and the burning in his shoulders, and still he walked. Every hour felt like a battle, and every step like a mountain. But he kept going because he made a promise without words. Promised to never let her die alone in the snow. And deep inside her dreams, Lyra saw her sister again, but this time the flames were gone, and someone was carrying her through the darkness toward light. Snow drifted down softer now, like ash from a dying fire, and Ethan felt every part of his body scream in silence, but his face stayed calm as he pushed forward with Lyra in his arms. Her head rested against his shoulder, and her skin was colder than before, and he knew time was slipping through his fingers like melting ice. The exoskeleton around his body gave a small jolt, and a flickering red light blinked near his waist, and he looked down and saw the power gauge had dropped to just 2 bars. He had carried heavy loads before, but never like this, and never with such care. And he tightened his grip on her, as if holding a piece of something sacred. Lyra stirred and whispered something in her own language, and then slowly opened her eyes, and her gaze fell on his face, and she said, "You are tired, you should rest." "You should rest." Him shook his head and said, I will rest when you are safe. She frowned and said, your machine is failing. I can feel it shaking with each step, and soon it will stop. And when that happens, we both will fall. He did not answer because he knew she was right, and every movement of the suit sent a wave of heat into his muscles, followed by a chill that felt like it came from the grave. They came to a steep hill covered in frozen moss and jagged rocks, and Ethan looked up and saw it was the only path forward, and he took a deep breath and began climbing. Each step was heavier than the last, and his knees buckled more than once, but he never dropped her, and the red light kept blinking faster now, like a heartbeat about to stop. Ria watched him in silence, and her expression changed from fear to something softer, something like respect. She reached out and touched the side of his face, and her fingers were cold but gentle. And she said, why do you fight for someone you do not even know? And paused on the slope and said, maybe I do know you, not with my mind, but with something deeper. She looked away and whispered, most humans I met looked at me like I was less than dirt. But you carry me like I matter, he said, because you do matter. And she blinked, and something like a tear formed in the corner of her eye, and she quickly wiped it away. The hill seemed endless, and the snow began falling heavier again, and the wind grew sharper, and Ethan's strength was slipping like sand through cracked fingers. My Woolly's thing. Ruby kiss. Ruby kiss. Ruby kiss. Only kiss. Only Ruby kiss has the luxury. Wally kiss. Kiss has the lux kissed. Ruby kiss. And Ruby kiss kissed this kick. He sees it with kiss. Lolly. Lesk. We kiss. We Samoda. We see. We met. We see. We see it. We see my s. Pro psi. Defos. We see pepubok's. We kikad me psi. The pekad kind. We all like klisa kakagria p mayak instead of me see kikami lisits by we aciditis and then Loud beep came from the suit, and the motor locked for a second, and his leg nearly gave out, but he forced himself upright and kept going. Red light turned orange, and then yellow, and he knew the emergency reserve had kicked in, and he had maybe 20 minutes left before everything shut down. Lyra looked at the control panel on his arm and said, "Stop and put me down, you are going to die." He shook his head and said, "Not today." She raised her voice and said, "I command you to stop." And he looked at her and said, "I do not follow orders from someone who thinks she is not worth saving." She stared at him with wide eyes and then slowly leaned her head against his chest again and said, "I was wrong about humans, or at least about one at the top of the hill. They found an old watchtower, broken and buried in snow, and Ethan kicked open the door and carried her inside. The air was still and dry, and for a moment he let himself fall to the ground with her still in his arms, and his body felt like it was made of stone. Lyra looked around and saw old supply crates and broken panels and one small solar lamp still intact, and she pointed to it and said, "Maybe we can use that." Ethan crawled over and connected the lamp wire to the suit input, and for a moment nothing happened. And then a small blue light blinked once, then twice. It was not much, but it gave him enough to power the servos in his arms and keep moving just a little longer. They sat in silence as the wind howled outside, and Lyra took a piece of bread from his bag and broke it in half and gave some to him. He smiled and said, "I thought you hated human food." And she replied, "Maybe I was just afraid to try it." They chewed slowly and shared the small meal like it was a feast. And then she looked at him and said, "When this is over, if we survive, will you come visit my world?" You thought softly and said, "Only if you promise to show me the good parts, not the parts that want to kill Mesh." Nodded and said, "Dill." Outside the storm was still roaring, but inside the broken tower, two lives kept each other warm and alive, and one machine still walked with a purpose stronger than metal. The wind screamed outside like a beast in pain, and the broken tower shook with every gust and Ethan held Lyra close as the suit powered down to low mode, saving every bit of energy it had left. The walls of the tower were made of old metal plates, and half of the roof was gone, and the snowflakes danced through the air like white fireflies glowing in the dark. It wrapped them both in the emergency blanket, but it was thin, and the cold still cut through, and he could feel Lyra shivering against him. She spoke with a weak voice, saying, "I thought I was ready to die before you came, but now I am not sure anymore." Thon looked into her glowing eyes and said, "Maybe that means you have something to live for." Now she closed her eyes and leaned her forehead against his chest, and her voice was almost a whisper when she said, "Maybe I just do not want to die alone." They stayed like that for a while, and neither said anything, and only the sound of the wind and the slow beating of two hearts filled the silence. Ethan started humming a song from Earth 1 that his mother used to sing when storms hit their home, and he did not remember the words, only the melody, and somehow it felt right. Lyra opened her eyes and asked, "What is that sound?" And he said, "It is called music," and she smiled softly and said, "It feels like warmth outside." The sky flashed with strange colors like ribbons of blue and green weaving through the black night, and Lyra pointed to them and said, "We call those the spirits of the sky, and they watch over travelers." Ethan looked at the lights and said, "Then maybe they brought me to you, and maybe they want us both to live." Lyra turned away and said, "I was taught that humans bring death, not hope, and I spent my life avoiding your kind, and now here I am in your arms fighting to stay alive." He said, "Sometimes truth is not what others tell us, but what we find when everything else is gone." She nodded slowly and reached into her coat and pulled out a small photo that looked old and worn and showed two young alien girls standing in front of a tree with silver leaves. She pointed to the one on the right and said, "That is my sister. Her name was Rena, and she was braver than me and kinder too, and she would have liked you." Ethan smiled and said, "I think I would have liked her too, and I am glad I met you even like this, even in the middle of this cold nightmare." Lyra held the photo to her chest and said, "She died protecting me when the humans attacked our village, but maybe she knew one day someone would protect me again, and said, I am sorry for what happened, and I wish I could change it." She said, "I do not want you to change the past. I just want you to keep going until we find the future." They both heard a soft crack, and Ethan turned quickly and saw a movement near the entrance of the tower, and his body tensed, and he reached for the flare gun on his belt. Lyra whispered, "It might be a snowcrawler," and Ethan nodded and aimed slowly and waited, but nothing came through the broken door. Lonely silence lowered the flare gun and listened, and the noise did not return, and he leaned back again and breathed deep and slow, trying to stay calm. The flare gun was down to its last charge, and he knew they had to use it wisely. Maybe when they saw a ship or a drone or anything from the base. He checked the wrist panel again, and the battery blinked at 1 bar, and the exosuit was now in full power-saving mode, which meant the arms would move, but the legs would not support much longer. "We have to go by sunrise," he said, and Lyra nodded and said, "We will go together." Ethan looked into her eyes and said, "Are you afraid?" And she replied, "Yes, but not of the cold or the snow or the creatures out there. I am afraid of losing the first person who ever saw me as more than an alien." Ethan placed a hand on her face gently and said, "Then we survive for each other." She took his hand in hers, and they stayed like that through the night, listening to the wind, watching the sky spirits, and waiting for the light of day. The sky turned pale blue as morning arrived, and the cold air felt sharper than before. And Ethan stretched his arms slowly as the joints of the exosuit creaked like old bones waking from sleep. Lyra opened her eyes and looked at him, and her voice was soft when she asked, "How long did I sleep?" And he replied, "Not long enough, but long enough to keep going." She gave a weak smile and tried to sit up, but pain shot through her legs, and she gasped, and he caught her before she fell and said, "Easy, I still have you outside." The wind had slowed and the snow had softened, and in the distance the mountains stood like silent watchers with white peaks that kissed the sky. Ethan helped Lyra drink the last of their water and eat the last dried fruit from his pouch, and she looked at it and asked, "What is this called?" And he said, "Mango," and she laughed a little and said it tastes like sunshine. He powered up the exosuit again, and the light flickered yellow, and he knew it meant only a few hours of movement remained, and maybe less if they faced rough ground. Lyra noticed his silence and asked, "How bad is it?" And he said, "It is enough to get us somewhere if we do not waste time." She said, "Then we go now, before the cold changes its mind," and Ethan nodded and lifted her in his arms and stepped out into the snow. Each step was heavy and slow, and the path ahead led through a frozen valley, where ice walls stood high like cliffs of glass, and echoes followed their movements. They walked for what felt like hours, and neither spoke much, and only their breaths and the quiet hum of the exosuit filled the air around them. Then Ethan paused and stared at the horizon, and Lyra followed his gaze and saw it too. A red light blinking in the distance, and smoke curling toward the clouds. That might be a camp, he said, or a signal post, or maybe another crash. And Lyra said, "We have to try," nodded and started walking faster, and the suit protested with beeps and sparks. But he kept moving, and the cold air bit deeper into his skin. Suddenly the snow gave way under his foot, and he slipped into a shallow pit, and Lyra cried out as they hit the ground, and his arm shielded her from the faller. "You hurt?" he asked, and she shook her head and asked, "You?" And he replied, "I am fine, just angry at this stupid planet." He stood up slowly and lifted her again, and the fall had drained more power from the suit, and now the warning sound was louder and faster. They reached a ridge and climbed it together, and on top they saw it clearly, an old human outpost half buried in snow, but still standing with one antenna broken and one still flashing red. Ethan whispered, "We made it," and Lyra held his arm tightly and said, "We are not safe yet." They approached the gate and found it locked and the scanner frozen, and Ethan slammed his shoulder against it, but the door held strong, and the exosuit groaned under the pressure. He pulled the flare gun from his belt and loaded the last flare and looked at Lyra, and she nodded once, and he fired it into the sky. The red flame shot upward and painted the snow in crimson light, and for a moment the world held its breath as the flare vanished into the clouds. They waited, and nothing happened, and silence returned like a heavy blanket, and Lyra whispered, "Maybe no one is watching." Ethan stepped back and looked around and saw a small vent shaft near the side of the outpost, half covered in ice and just wide enough for a person to crawl through. "I am going in," said, and Lyra asked, "Are you sure?" And he said, "I have to try," and he placed her gently against the wall and kissed her forehead and said, "Stay warm." She grabbed his hand and said, "Come back to me," and he nodded and crawled into the shaft as snow began falling again inside. It was dark and narrow, and the metal was ice cold, and he moved slowly as the suit scraped against the walls, and his breath came in shallow bursts. He reached the end and kicked open a vent cover and dropped into a control room, where broken screens flickered and dust danced in the light of emergency lamps. He found the power switch and pulled it, and the lights blinked, and the doors outside clicked open, and he ran back to Lyra, who smiled with tears in her eyes. They entered the outpost and closed the door behind them, and warmth returned little by little as the heaters activated, and Lyra whispered, "We are a Leviathan," collapsed beside her and smiled and said, "We made it." The warmth inside the old outpost felt like a dream. And Ethan leaned back against the metal wall with eyes half closed while Lyra sat beside him, wrapped in a thick rescue blanket. They found near the entrance. Her color looked better, and her breathing was more steady, but her legs were still swollen and motionless, and her hand trembled as she held a cup of warm water. "You should rest," she said. And Ethan shook his head slowly and said later, "First we call for help." The control panel inside the outpost was half frozen and half buried in dust, and Wires hung from the ceiling like vines from a dead tree, and Ethan wiped the screen and pressed the power switch. Nothing. He opened the access hatch and saw that the battery cells were corroded and the emergency power had only been enough to open the doors and heat one room. Lyra looked at him and asked, "Now what?" And he replied, "Now I find another way." He stood up with a groan and checked the map carved into the wall beside the panel, and it showed a tower on top of the hill connected to this outpost by a maintenance tunnel. If the relay beacon is still up there, he said, "maybe, Sfuta, I can send a signal through it." Lyra stared at him with worry in her eyes and said, "That tower is exposed. If the storm comes back, you will not make." Ethan looked at her and smiled gently and said, "Then I better hurry." He took the last energy cell from the supply locker and slotted it into the exosuit, and it buzzed weakly as the system flickered to life again, and the power bar turned yellow, for now it was enough. Before he left, Lyra took his hand and pressed something small into his palm, and when he looked, he saw it was her glowing family stone, the same one she had used to warm him days ago. He said, "You keep it," and she said, "No, you carry it now. It is your light." When darkness comes, Ethan walked into the tunnel, which was dark and narrow and smelled of rust and ice, and every step echoed through the metal path like footsteps in a forgotten cave. After 10 minutes, the tunnel opened into a vertical shaft with Kasika Suse, with Kasus with Kasekta, when with Kaseka, the Wallo Kutchers, Wal Kamat. When we saw the wall of Kamat. We saw with Kasek. Those my Kuma, we saw Kamisikal Selt. We saw I like. I take we saw we app. Dup it lie it. By we saw ka with the wix I meant. By saw with I see it. Is it to we so sicka bay I sips. Ye sit it by we I do sit to back up it to sit tick up with it gets gun to art lisa to take a statistic kid and Swiss all that with it with this is a can't. Have put a broken ladder reaching upward, and he looked up at the round hatch above, and then at the warning light flashing near the base. The sign read, "Danger, high winds," and Ethan took a deep breath and began to climb, and the suit groaned with every motion. As he carried his weight upward, the wind hit him the moment he opened the hatch, and it almost knocked him backward. But he pulled himself through and crawled onto the snowy platform that circled the tower. He looked around and saw nothing but white skies and frozen land stretching far and wide, and in the middle of it all stood the relay beacon covered in ice and leaning slightly as if tired from standing too long. Ethan made his way to the beacon and opened the control box, and the cold bit deep into his fingers, even through the gloves, and he connected the glowing stone to the beacon's backup port, and the lights blinked green. He pressed the send button, and the signal pulsed once, then twice, and then vanished into the sky above, and he stared at the screen and waited, and then a message appeared: "Signal received, base responding in 4 hours." Smiled and turned away from the beacon, just as the wind screamed louder and the storm came back with sudden furious snow-whipped around him, and the metal floor shook, and he tried to move, but a blast of wind sent him flying against the railing, and he hit it hard and felt something crack in his shoulders. Exosuit flashed red, and one leg motor locked, and he tried to crawl. But the pain was sharp and hot, and his vision blurred. He gritted his teeth and pulled himself to the hatch and dropped into the tunnel and tumbled down the ladder and landed hard at the bottom. For a few minutes he could not move, and the cold crept in and the light from the stone dimmed, and he thought of Lyra alone and afraid and waiting for his return. He rolled onto his side and reached for the wall and used the last of his strength to push himself forward through the tunnel, dragging one leg behind him like dead weight. Every breath felt like fire, and his hands were bleeding, but he kept moving because giving up was not an option. Not now, not after everything. He saw the door ahead, and Lyra standing there with wide eyes and tears running down her face as she ran to him and pulled him into the warmth of the outpost. "You came back," she whispered, and he nodded and said, "I told you I would." She wrapped her arms around him and held him tight, and for the first time since the crash, Ethan let himself cry. The soft hum of the heaters filled the quiet as Ethan rested inside the outpost, and Lyra sat beside him, holding a cloth to the bruises on his face, while his eyes blinked, slowly fighting the pull of sleep. She had never seen someone so broken and yet still alive, and she whispered his name like a prayer, and he opened his eyes and smiled weakly. "You made it back," she said, and he replied, "I told you I would always come back." Outside, the snow had stopped, and the sky turned from white to soft pink. As morning light touched the distant hills, and for the first time in days, the air felt calm. They shared the last food bar together, and Lyra said, "It tastes like glue," and Ethan laughed and said, "You will get used to it," and she replied, "I hope no." Checked the panel again, and the message still blinked on the screen. "Rescue team inbound, arrival in 1 hour," and the words felt like magic. Lyra stared at the message and then at him and said, "I never thought I would be glad to see humans again," and Ethan said, "I never thought I would risk my life for someone who once wanted me gone." They sat together in silence, watching the light grow brighter through the small window, and Lyra reached out and took his hand, and her fingers were warm now. And, "Steady, do you think they will take me back to your world?" she asked, and Ethan said, "I do not see why not." And she said, "What if your people hate me?" And he said, "Then they will have to deal with." Mesh looked at him with wide eyes and asked, "Why do you care so much?" And he looked back and said, "Because when I carry you, I feel like I am carrying hope, not just for us, but for something bigger." They heard the low roar of engines in the distance, and Lyra stood slowly leaning on the wall, and Ethan helped her up, and they stepped outside into the light. The air was still cold but gentle, and the clouds opened above them, revealing a sky so blue it made Lyra gasped, and she said, "I never thought I would see the sky like this." Again, a small rescue shuttle descended from above, kicking up snow and dust, and 2 medics stepped out wearing white suits, and one of them shouted his name, and Ethan raised his hand and smiled. The medics ran to them and checked Ethan's vitals and gently placed Lyra on a hover stretcher, and she held onto his arm, refusing to let go. "They are with me," she said to the medics. And they nodded and said, "Both of you are going home inside." The shuttle, the warmth was like summer, and the walls glowed with soft lights, and Lyra looked out the window as the shuttle lifted and the outpost shrank below. Ethan sat beside her and said, "We made it." And she said, "Because you never gave up." And he said, "Because you gave me a reason not to during the flight." The medics treated his shoulder and wrapped his ribs, and Lyra was given pain medicine and a new blanket, and she curled into it like a child who had not slept in years. She looked at Ethan and said, "What happens now?" And he said, "Now we heal, and maybe we tell our story, and maybe someone will believe it, and maybe they will not, but we will know the truth." She smiled and said, "Maybe we can change the way our worlds see each other." And he said, "Maybe we already did." When the shuttle landed at the human base, there were doctors and officers and reporters waiting, but Ethan asked for privacy, and they allowed him a quiet room where he could sit with Lyra and just breathe. She was given a translator device and spoke more clearly now, and she said, "I was a voice no one wanted to hear, and you heard me, and I was a person no one wanted to save, and you saved me." He said, "I was a soldier trained to follow orders, and I broke all of them just to keep you alive, and I would do it again." She looked at him for a long time and then leaned forward and placed her forehead against his, and for that moment there was no human, no alien. Just 2 souls who survived something that was meant to destroy them. Later that day, Ethan stood by the window, watching snow fall gently outside, and Lyra joined him and said, "It looks beautiful when it is not trying to kill you." And he laughed and said, "Everything is like that sometimes." She reached into her pocket and gave him a new glowing crystal and said, "This is yours now, and it carries a story of pain, strength, and kindness." And he held it in his palm and said, "Then I will carry it, always outside." The snow kept falling, but now it felt different, softer, kinder, as if the world itself had changed because one human carried one alien through. A storm and neither gave up, and somewhere in the quiet between heartbeats and footsteps, a new future began.